Welcome to the Thought Decoders YouTube channel. I'm Sean Mixon, your host, and today I'm joined by the man, the myth, the legend, none other than one of the most scary smart people William Lane Craig has ever come across, and probably the only person I've heard him use that phrase with, and it's Dr. Graham Oppy. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
Oh, no problem. Dr. Oppy, so today I would love to end with you sharing some ideas about your approach in making the best case for atheism. But before we do, I'm interested in learning about you and what shaped you and made you into the person you are today. I think I understand that you grew up in a religious background, but it was kind of like, could you talk about that and say how that affected you? Was it a deeply religious or strict? However you frame it, how would you frame that?
Okay, so my parents were Methodists, and in fact, the Oppies have been Methodists for centuries. So the Oppies were miners in Cornwall, and the Wesleys, Charles and John, especially John Wesley, spent a lot of time evangelising in Cornwall. That was one of their main centres where the mining communities were. And so there's a kind of, a long chain of Methodists. Now, of course, people vary. Regardless of your denomination, there are some people who are kind of deeply religious and some people for whom it's more nominal and so on. There were some pretty deeply religious people in my family history, ministers. At one stage, my father thought about becoming a minister. My parents met in church. But as they got older, especially my father, became kind of, I think, less and less intensely religious, right? And I wouldn't say that my upbringing was really strict. I went to Sunday school and then to church and said prayers in the evening, things like that. And that lasted until I was 12 or 13 years old. And then I just kind of decided that I didn't believe the things that I was being told in Sunday school and church, and that I wasn't really interested in attending anymore or taking part in the practices. And so, at least for me, it kind of all lapsed. I had plenty of other friends who were religious, and I used to love arguing with them about religion. That was something that from the various early high school days that I enjoyed a lot. I argued with teachers as well. But that's kind of, I guess that's kind of the back.
Wow, you seem so quiet. I mean, were you always kind of introverted? Like, how did those arguments go?
Well, they were like, they were conversations like this one. I call them arguments because there was kind of difference in opinion. But no, I think I've always been much the same. I've always been quite introverted, and I much prefer talking in a conversational way with people one-on-one than and I don't kind of enjoy shouting matches and trying to put people down, things like that.
Okay. Was there anyone in your family that was like strongly religious? Your immediate household? Did you have siblings?
Yeah, I have a brother and two sisters, and none of them was or is more religious than I am. My mother was quite devout, so and I don't think that it diminished for her. So I remember she died of cancer. She died in the hospital, and we were there. I remember on the morning that she died, she kind of woke up and she sang one of her favourite hymns. And that's kind of an indication of the kind of depth of her faith, I think. So that persisted with her until she died. My father, on the other hand, the last part of his life, so in the period when he was dying, he was exploring world religions. He was looking at things like some American indigenous beliefs, and it was clear to me anyway that he didn't have any particularly deep religious convictions anymore, though he kind of I mean, my sense was that he would like to have some, but he just didn't. And there's more I could say about that, but it's probably not worth going into. Right? I mean, that's just his story.
Okay. Yeah. So, was your dad particularly religious when you were a kid?
I think he was still, so he was a steward in the church and he taught in the Sunday school. I would say he was quite religious when I was young. So up until past the time when I stopped being religious, I think he was still quite religious. And as I said, there was a time before he met my mother when he was thinking about entering ministry. So yeah, I would say he was, I mean, there was a period of his life when he was quite religious. But I think this is right, that it kind of waned for him over time.
And did anybody discuss theology when you were growing up? Does anyone talk
Okay, so
about
that's an interesting question. So when I mean, just a couple of more bits of kind of background information. When Billy Graham came to Australia, which he did several times, my parents went to see him. My mother in particular was a big reader, and we had lots of books in bookcases, and there was a shelf full of books by C.S. Lewis, a bunch of other people who you would think of as sort of broadly theologians. So that was there. I didn't read those books. They were the adult books, and I was a child. But I did read all the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis.
That's what did it for you, huh? The Narnia books. Well, what was your first memory of like tragedy? Was it before you became an atheist, or during, or after?
So I think I had a pretty sheltered childhood as far as tragedy goes. The first person who died that I was close to was my grandfather. I would have been, I'm just trying to think how old I was when he died. I was actually close to, maybe a bit before the time that I stopped believing. And I don't remember. I couldn't exactly say which year it was that I stopped believing. So I think I was 11 when my grandfather died. And it was probably after that. I don't see any connection between those two events.
So when you stopped believing, was it okay? So I'm thinking about believing, and I'm thinking,
yeah,
is that is it believing conscious? Like to stop believing, it almost seems like you had. Did you feel like you were choosing to believe before you stopped believing?
So I guess it was just I had all these beliefs because that's what I've been taught, right? And I didn't choose to believe those things. I mean, I don't think that much belief is really subject to the will. I mean, you can change what you end up believing by concentrating on some things and not on others. Like I have some beliefs about quantum mechanics. If I'd chosen not to study quantum mechanics at university, I wouldn't have those beliefs. So there's that kind of effect, but you don't directly choose what you believe. I just, my parents told me things and I believed them. And then at a certain point, I started asking myself questions about, there were things that just didn't add up to me.
Okay.
And I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, there was a process where I was kind of turning things over in my mind, and then I just definitely didn't have the beliefs anymore. But I don't think that was a choice either. That was just the way that I was responding to the information that I had.
So do you remember what started that process?
No, I don't. So I can't remember what I was thinking about, even what the reasons were. Right? So I'm like 12 or 13 years old, and it's a long time ago, and I don't remember the content. I don't remember what my reasons were, why I don't remember what it was about the beliefs that I'd had previously that I'd come not to like.
Would you say
maybe it would have been good if I'd kept a diary or something like that?
Oh,
but
right.
I've never been a diarist, so I just have no idea.
So you don't remember like what the first questions that didn't make sense were to you.
No.
And you said you would also have conversations with your teachers and things as well. Were they religious teachers or were they just normal?
So when I was about 15, my English teacher gave me a bit out of Pascal's Ponces, the wager part out of the Ponces, and said, read this and tell me what you think about it. Right, so it wasn't a secret that I was not a believer. It wasn't a secret amongst the teachers, and so this teacher thought maybe
Really?
it would. Yeah. So
Was it a secret? I mean, was it like?
I mean, it wasn't a
Did
secret
you get
with
a
my
reputation?
friends either.
Did you get a reputation for?
So I guess partly because I used to write stuff. So there were school magazines, and I wrote pieces where I expressed my views about religion. So that's why it wasn't a secret.
Wow, that I don't know how common that is.
Well, maybe it's not common, but yeah.
Wow.
But also, so I've been to a couple of school reunions over the last decade. I mean, they come along about once every 10 years. And people come up to me and say that they remember arguing with me about religion when we were at school. And I can't remember it, but I assume that they're telling me the truth. So,
Well, so when you look, I mean, do you still have some of these writings?
they
Okay.
just, I don't know, ephemeral. They just, maybe somebody somewhere does, but I mean, why would you keep them? They were just, stapled together pages. Yeah.
Okay. Do you feel like you were like terrible at it at your younger ages? Like you got better over time with your arguments, or what do you think about
Well, they're the products of someone who was 15 years old and feeling quite rebellious. So I don't know. I bet they were not convincing, and they wouldn't. I mean, and there'd be lots of perspectives from which you'd say they weren't very good, but that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. And then, so you were pretty much exposed to philosophy in high school then. Was that high school?
Yeah. So I was given by another teacher a copy of Bertrand Russell's autobiography for my 15th or 16th birthday, my 15th birthday, I think. And so I read that when I was in my mid-teens. I was very impressed by the life that Russell had led. And at that stage, I was already thinking that maybe I would like to be a philosopher. I had other interests. I was interested in maths, for example. So I also thought maybe I would become a mathematician. But but philosophy was definitely on my radar.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you graduate from high school, and then what happens?
I went to study medicine,
Oh,
which
wow.
which really didn't make much sense. That was more I kind of caved into pressure from people who said you can't go and study philosophy. What a waste of your life. So, and in the end, I gave in. So I went to study medicine, and I was not a good student in the medical faculty. So I did
Was
1
it
year,
boring?
and I spent my time reading philosophy because that was what I really wanted to do.
Wow.
And then at the end of the year, I just transferred out of medicine and transferred into. So I did 2 degrees, a science degree and an arts degree. I majored in maths and philosophy, minored in physics and history and philosophy of science. So that kind of suggests what my interests were.
Yeah, that sounds like 6
really.
different things you just told me. How many degrees did you end up?
So I did 2 undergraduate degrees.
Was it I mean, we have something called an associate's degree, like a 2-year degree. Was it any of those?
So no, these were just bachelor's degrees. So I have
So you
Bachelor
did
of
2
Arts and a
bachelors.
Bachelor of Science. Yeah. I really wanted to do maths and philosophy, and maths was in the science faculty and philosophy was in the arts faculty, and there was no way of persuading either faculty to let me do a major in the other faculty if I enrolled just in a single degree. So I enrolled in a double. So I enrolled in them both. It wasn't, these days you can actually, in the Australian system, there's all kinds of double degrees that are kind of officially recognised that you can do, like you can do arts and engineering. And it's a kind of tailored program. My program wasn't tailored. I just did 2 full degrees, kind of simultaneously.
Okay. And about how long did 2 double undergraduate degrees take?
So they gave me credit for the year I'd spent doing medicine, so it took
Oh,
5 more
wow.
years. So I was an undergraduate for 6 years.
Okay.
And then I did an honours year in philosophy, so that was the 7th year as an undergraduate. It took me a very long time to get
Wow.
through my undergraduate.
Wow. So,
Yeah.
then I believe you studied math for your graduate degree?
For the graduate degree, I did philosophy. So
Oh, you did philosophy.
yeah.
Okay.
So I'd thought about continuing with maths, and when I started the honours year, which is the kind of 4th year in philosophy, I thought that I would the next year do honours in maths, which would have meant another year, an 8th year of being an undergraduate. But I decided after I'd done philosophy that I wanted to continue with it, and that I wouldn't do any more mathematics after that.
And did you get married during those 8 years?
I got married. After that, I started doing a master's degree in philosophy. And while I was doing that, I got married, and then we moved to New Jersey, and I did a PhD in the United States. So I lived in New Jersey for a few years doing PhD.
Oh, wow. And so, but where did you work while you were doing your undergrad, or was it like work
So I
study?
was living in. So my undergrad, I was living in Melbourne. I was at Melbourne University the whole time, and then for the graduate degree, I went to Princeton.
Oh, so you did your...
Yeah, I did my PhD up here at Princeton.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And who did you study under there?
It was a very good time to be at Princeton. The faculty there was amazing. So my advisor was Gilbert Harmon, but the other people on my committee were David Lewis, Bas van Frassen, and Mark Johnston. So I just it's hard to believe really how good.
Oh my God.
And so other people who were there included Saul, quite a place back in the late 80s.
Wow. Were you able to study with any of those individuals, like take classes?
Yes. So so they called it a preceptor. I mean, like a tutor for David Lewis. So there were 2 of his classes where basically I did the grading and the office hours with the students and things like that, and he did the lectures.
Oh wow. Oh wow. So you not only you work closely with them.
So yes, of the people at Princeton, David was the one that I worked the closest with, and Gil because he was my advisor.
And did you ever get into any arguments with David Lewis?
So not, and I didn't agree with him about everything. So in that sense, I suppose yes. But he's a lovely guy, really. He was very nice to me. So I didn't ever get into any sort of confrontations with him.
Okay. So who's your favorite philosopher? Or do you have one?
Okay, so I'll go historical because it's kind of, I mean, talking about the living would mean drawing, distinctions that I wouldn't like to draw. I guess historically my favourite philosopher is David Hume. I think Hume was wrong about lots of things, but when he was wrong, mostly he was wrong in interesting ways, and he was also right about lots of things too. And he seems to have been, in his interactions with other people, mostly quite an admirable person. And he had views that these days people would rightly regard as quite obnoxious, like lots of the modern philosophers, and Kant's another example. He was racist, for example. That seems to have been very common amongst Europeans generally in that period. But his views, I mean, I really love the dialogues concerning natural religion. I think that that's a really fantastic bit of philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And so, did you ever take a logic class?
So I've taught logic quite a bit. My first jobs involved, so I had So where did I work? I taught logic at the University of Sydney for a semester, and I taught logic at Wollongong for 2.5 years. And when I first came to Monash, I taught logic as well. So I quite a lot of teaching of logic. When I was an undergraduate, there was a lot of logic in my studies. So I studied logic not only in the philosophy department, but in the maths department. Because remember,
wow.
I did a maths major as well as a philosophy major, and logic was taught quite differently in the maths department. So in one semester of maths, we started from scratch, and we worked in the end through a proof of Gödel's incompleteness theorem.
Oh, wow.
So in philosophy, you might do 3 logic classes and still not get to the incompleteness proof.
Wow.
So it kind of went like a rocket. It was taught by a guy his specialty was algebra. And there's kind of close connections between algebra and propositional logic. So it's kind of understandable why he might have had an interest in logic as well. But I also, in philosophy, as an undergraduate, I studied modal logic. I studied substructural logic. And I did an introductory class in first year, we did a few lectures on propositional calculus, but then the next year I did a class that was a kind of fairly thorough treatment of classical propositional predicate logic.
Wow.
So I did a lot. I studied lots of logic. By the time I got to graduate school, that turned out to be kind of an advantage, because in graduate school, one of the requirements was that you had to do some logic. And I already knew enough logic to pass the assessment that you had to do without doing any further study of logic.
Wow. Yeah, I doubt if the teacher could do the incomplete. What was it? Incompleteness?
Incompleteness result. Yeah. So there was one other thing I was going to say.
So you studied it?
What I did doesn't happen anymore. There's no Australian university where you could do that much logic as an undergraduate now.
Wow.
Times have changed quite a bit. In fact, you couldn't. I did a lot of philosophy when I was an undergraduate, because they had a stream that you could go into where you could overload and do kind of a whole lot of extra credit points in your major if you wanted to. So I studied almost everything in philosophy that Melbourne taught while I was there. I took almost every subject they had, and that included that wide range of logic subjects. But these days, the way that universities work, you can't study half as many subjects as I did when I was an undergraduate.
Wow. Yeah, and then it's a lot more expensive as well, right?
Yeah, I've got 3 sons. They've all got very large university debts.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite unfortunate that we have less education for triple the price. But yeah, that's interesting. So 2 questions. What would be, do you have a favorite logic textbook? Is there any text that takes you from ground zero to advance? Is there anything like that out there?
So I forget what it's called, but Greg Restall's textbook is pretty good. It starts from zero and it takes you quite a long way.
Oh, really?
My favourite textbooks are much more advanced ones. So I really liked the Boulos and Jeffrey book, which I think was called Computability and Logic. But that's quite advanced. And if you're trying to begin logic, it won't be a good place to start, because it just moves through far too quickly through the earliest bits. I forget what Greg Restall's book's called, but it's something like Introduction to Logic. It'll be some version of that. I think it's quite good.
Are you familiar with Suzanne Langer, or is it Susan Langer?
Okay, so now we're talking much earlier. So Langer, I don't know, when's her textbooks written? In the 30s, the 40s, something like that?
She was an exceptional writer. I think she was taught by Alfred Whitehead. Was her, I guess, and then she was like one of the first women to earn her PhD in the 20s. But I've read her text on symbolic logic, and it's so wonderful. And now I kind of think, I've been thinking about it. It seems like maybe it was more what we would call set theory than just like more like it wasn't really propositional logic or predicate. It was more like she was doing things with sets and showing these logical relations between them.
Okay, so maybe some of that was kind of Venn diagrams, something that's kind of useful, perhaps more useful if you're doing Aristotelian logic, doing syllogisms, than if you're doing predicate calculus. The way that logic textbooks work, what logic textbooks actually teach, has changed an awful lot in the last 100 years. The logic that is now considered kind of basic predicate calculus really wasn't developed into a teachable form until the 1920s and the 19th.
Okay. And so when did you, was there a point when you began to apply what you were learning in logic to philosophy in terms of like analyzing arguments? Was there a moment like that for you?
Not really. I do remember as an undergraduate, one of the essays that I wrote, I took the section out of Hume's treatise on promises, and I went through the arguments that he gave, and I turned them all into kind of standard form in predicate calculus and assessed them. So I guess from the beginning, at that point, I saw having some logical facility as a useful tool for a philosopher to have. According to my analysis, which really wasn't that interesting, all of Hume's arguments were at least valid. So
What? Wow. Wow, that's crazy. So no one showed you this. You just kind of saw it on your own. You saw, hey, I can use that on this.
No, I guess that's not right. I mean, if you go back to so I remember the first class I took in philosophy, and the person who was lecturing wrote up the names of 3 or 4 articles and said you might want to read these. And so, of course, I went off to the library and I read them all. And it was very much in the kind of style that philosophy was done. So I'm going to these classes in the 70s. They're referring to stuff that's written from the mid-60s to the mid-70s mostly. And all of this stuff is doing what I thought I was doing when I was doing my analysis of Hume. They were using predicate calculus. They were taking bits of text and putting them into some sort of standard form according to predicate calculus and then evaluating the arguments. So it's certainly not a technique I made up for myself. It was something that I absorbed because of the things that I was reading. It's not that we're explicitly taught to do that. It's just that you couldn't help but notice that that's what all of the philosophers that we were given to read were doing.
Okay, and so now that leads us up to your career in philosophy. And what was the motivation? Was it intentional for you to specifically work in philosophy of religion, or would you not frame your career that way, or how would you classify it?
Okay, so despite all the philosophy that I did at Melbourne as an undergraduate, there was only one philosophy of religion subject that was taught by Bruce Langtry, and the timing is it's about 19, and Swinburne's book, The Existence of God, and Mackey's book, The Miracle of Theism, are both very recent. So we were assigned both texts, and we looked at a couple of topics. So the topics that we talked about were, I think, possibly design arguments and miracles, and we looked at what Swinburne and Mackey had to say about both of those. That was it, right? No philosophy of religion in graduate school. I went to graduate school to work in philosophy of language, and I wrote a PhD on semantics of propositional attitude descriptions. I won't bother to try to explain what that is. It was a kind of arcane topic in philosophy of language. And then when I was finished, I came back to Australia, and I was unemployed for 6 months. At least I had no employment, right? It was the beginning of 1990. I didn't have a job. But there were people who knew that I was in the country and that I'd want to do something. And there was a course at the Australian National University in philosophy of religion that needed someone to teach it. And they offered it to me, and although I actually didn't really know much about philosophy of religion, I said, sure, I can do that. And so I spent the whole semester sort of 1 week ahead of the students, reading in the literature, working out what I was going to teach them, and then writing it up as a handout and giving it out in the lecture as part of what I was doing. So the course was 26 lectures. I made the course about arguments for and against the existence of God, and I taught myself about the arguments over the course of that semester. So by the end of the semester, I knew a reasonable amount about arguments about the existence of God, and I actually wrote up a couple of things that were published as a result of what I'd done in that unit.
Really?
So
Okay.
that was how I got into philosophy of religion. When I left graduate school, I did not think that I would ever write a paper in philosophy of religion. It just didn't cross my mind. I published some stuff in aesthetics because I'd done some work on aesthetics on the side while I was at Princeton, but I hadn't thought about philosophy of religion at all. So then I got, as I said before, I got work doing logic and basically teaching formal logic, informal logic, things like that for a couple of years. And then it was really an off chance. My wife saw an ad in the newspaper for this new research funding scheme that was being introduced by the Australian government. And you could apply to this scheme to get funding to do a postdoc in a university. And she said, you should look at this. And so I wrote to Frank Jackson at ANU and I said, would you support an application if I made one up? And he said, you've got no chance of getting this. Why don't you go ahead and try? And so I spent an afternoon writing up my application, and I didn't put much thought into it. I said, I'll write a book, epistemology. That was what I said in the grant application. And somewhat surprisingly, they gave me this postdoc. So I had 3 years at the ANU in which I was supposed to be working on reformed epistemology. And I started with Plantinga's ontological argument, and I didn't get past thinking about ontological arguments. I ended up writing a book about ontological arguments, but that was the outcome of this. And once I'd done that, I was kind of committed to philosophy of religion. But it was 2 accidents that led me to go down that path. The getting offered the contract teaching, and then my wife seeing the ad in the newspaper. Right, life's like that. It's full of kind of weird little things.
Yeah, but in a way, I guess it's just the way we've kind of just gone through your life from the beginning. And to me, it's almost like a full circle. It's like you started back where where you begin in some senses, studying these arguments, for the existence of God and natural theology. So would you say that that's kind of been your area of specialization? Would it be philosophy of religion, or do you think it's even more narrow than that?
So, there are 2 things. I've done work outside philosophy of religion of various kinds. I'm currently writing a book about arguing, and that's got nothing to do with philosophy of religion. It's related to my interest in arguments about the existence of God, but there's no discussion of religion in this book. It's just a book about arguing. I wouldn't say that everything in philosophy of religion has been of interest to me. And I started off, I really did work for a long time just on arguments about the existence of God, and then I broadened that out and I thought a bit more about divine attributes, and I wrote a book about that. And then I started thinking on a kind of bigger scale about how to evaluate positions, so naturalism versus theism. And so for the last, up until I started working on the book on arguing about 3 years ago, there was a long period up to that point where I've been thinking about how to assess naturalism versus theism. And that's not exactly the same topic as kind of assessing individual arguments for the existence of God, though maybe you can think of them as being related.
Right. And what's interesting is you have some of the we are very similar in our interests. Like I have an interest in logic, but I have an interest in arguing, right? And it's the right? I saw it as a tool for argumentation and solving disputes. And to me, that's what made my interest. And so I would like to teach philosophy of religion and logic. That's just like, if I can teach three things, it would be philosophy of religion, logic, and maybe systematic theology. I'm currently a student in seminary, Dallas Theological Seminary. And I kind of like what Bill Craig is doing right now with his, I guess he's writing a philosophical theology where he's looking at the attributes of God and things like that. And I like that. I also like what Dr. Planning did when I guess he's looking at the implications of other views, which to me that would be kind of like similar, like looking at worldviews and what are their, to use the language I've heard you use in interviews, with what are the virtues of each position and who explains things better and things like that. Yeah, so I guess that leads us to your methodology. So how do we argue?
Right. So what do we do when we disagree? So I think that the most important part about what you do when you disagree, or what you ought to do, is to find out as much as you can about the other person's position. Right. So what you want to do is you want to work out exactly what it is that the two contesting parties believe. If we're imagining that we're just kind of evaluating two positions. Right. The most important bit is to work out what the people are committed to. What claims do they hold? And this part can go on for a very long time.
What would motivate that? Because I'm thinking about like the political sphere in America. Like no one cares about what the
right. And there is a view that you might have, that you might take about that, sort of corresponding to that attitude, that you could apply to religion too, right? So you can imagine two people from different religions just saying, well, I'm not interested in learning what the other people think. The reason why it matters is because arguing is not going to be productive unless you know what the other person thinks. That's my view.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it might be that it's hard to make arguing productive, disagreeing productive at all. But I think you can be sure that it won't be if you don't bother to learn what the other people think. And I think that this applies to politics just as much as it applies to religion. And of course, you have to, just as a matter of kind of prudence, you have to choose who you're going to have arguments and discussions with, because there may be people who, for various reasons, it will just be a kind of waste of your time to try to have a serious argument with them, right? But there are lots of people for whom that's not the case. So I think that I've had very interesting and productive discussions about religion with people with whom I deeply disagree. And I mean, one of my examples would be the book that I wrote with Kenny Pierce, the Is There a God book, where we disagree about a huge number of things, but the book itself, I think, is quite interesting. And the discussions that we had led both of us to kind of revise our opinions about various things, and that's kind of productive, I think.
Okay. It looks like that's a interesting point. Now, how do you define productivity? Like you say, you have to see if it's productive.
So I think that interchanges between people who disagree can be productive, even if they don't come closer to agreeing, just so long as they improve their views as a result. And that can happen because other people, when they learn enough about your view, maybe will see difficulties with it that you can't see, and that when they point those things out to you, you then have to think about them, and there's at least the possibility that your view will get better as a result if you're trying to take account of the criticisms that they've made. So that's the sense in which I think it can be productive. It can, raise everybody's boat right? Everybody's views will get better if it's done properly. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be any convergence. I think that this is controversial, but what I think that both in politics and in religion, there are no gurus. There are no globally recognized experts who we think, oh, they've got the truth. We all agree they've got the truth and we can just get it from them. It's rather, even if you think that there are kind of experts in politics and religion, they disagree with one another, right? So there's no prospect that we're going to come, any of us, whether we're the experts or whether we're not, that we're going to come to a global agreement about where the truth lies in politics or in religion or in philosophy generally. It just seems to be the nature of these things that we shouldn't expect convergence of expert opinion, and so we shouldn't expect convergence of opinion. That means, I think, that the thing that I say you can get kind of local improvements in views is probably the most that it's reasonable to hope for out of disagreements in these areas.
And an improvement would be removing, responding to a difficulty in the view, or would the difficulty be like inconsistency?
So in the most extreme case, removing inconsistencies, that's one way of improving a view. But another way would be simplifying the view, so dropping some commitments from it. Another way would be coming up with better explanations for data than you had previously. That would be another way that you could improve your view. So all of those things at least.
So is that a concern of like, would that be more of a pragmatic concern, meaning you want your view to help you make it through the world in everyday life?
So I'm not thinking that you have to be a pragmatist to take this approach. You can think that your view is true, right? It's just that you have to recognize that the people that you're talking to are going to think that their view is true as well. And what you're disagreeing about is where the truth lies, right? So I'm not thinking about this.
Okay.
I'm not actually, I haven't got any kind of particular meta-philosophical axe that I'm grinding at this point. We can be, hardcore realists about everything, right? That doesn't change you can make your view better, right?
Okay.
In these respects. You'll just think that you're kind of getting closer to having a view where it's all true. Like, pick any individual thing you believe you think it's true. The probability that you assign to some things won't be much greater than a half, but some things you'll be pretty certain about. If I ask you what's the probability that the conjunction of all the things that you believe is true, the answer is going to be very close to zero, right? I mean, this is familiar to philosophers as the paradox of the preface. It's just, it's extraordinarily unlikely that you're right about everything.
Right. And that, I don't know how I feel about that, but I'm thinking, wouldn't a improvement to a view be its persuasiveness? What do you think about that?
So not really. You could think that as a view improves, it's going to be more attractive, more believable, or something like that. Persuasiveness suggests something about kind of selling the view to others. And I'm not sure that if you imagine what I was saying about if things go well when we argue, we both improve our views. It suggests that if that's what's actually happening, it's not going to be that the relative persuasiveness changes. As in, it's not going to seem any more my view's not going to seem any more persuasive to you, and your view's not going to seem any more persuasive to me.
But
even
what about
though I
other
recognise that your view's got. So
I can imagine we both work on our views, and then we go share our views with other people, and they're like, "Oh, that sounds a lot better than last time. I don't know how you got it to make more sense." Then in my mind, I'm thinking, "Oh, is that guy?"
Yeah, so maybe, but I mean, it depends who the other people are, right? Because they may also have been working on their views in the meantime, right? I mean, if they are philosophers or political theorists or whatever, they'll have been working on their views too.
Right.
Right?
What if we can
And
just stipulate that after you've sharpened your views with the I guess an interlocutor, there's a set of people, and that set has a certain amount of people, and after sharpening your view, you get more percentage of the set that accepts your view. It seems like that kind of thing is a virtue of review in addition to consistency. Like it seems like consistency and persuasiveness is better than consistency without persuasiveness. I guess that's what I'm.
so I guess I'm inclined to make a pessimistic induction at this point. I just don't think that happens. So if you look at philosophy and you look at convergence of opinion, I don't think that there's any more convergence of opinion in philosophy in 2024 than there was in 500 BC, right?
Uh-huh.
So the thing that you're describing just doesn't happen,
But
right?
what
It's not
about
like,
theoretically?
it's not like a couple of people refine their views and
Right.
then lots of other people start agreeing with them. That just isn't how it works.
But theoretically, would you agree in principle with the idea?
So I don't know. It depends what you mean by in principles.
Like I'm saying, like
I'm prepared to think that the truth's out there, right? There's a fact of the matter about a whole lot of claims in philosophy, religion, and politics. But if we were kind of ideal agents, then we'd all believe those things. But that doesn't help us in our current situation. And it doesn't, I mean, making that idealization, supposing that we've got superpowers, just doesn't shed any light on the situation that we're actually in, right? And so when you ask me, could it be ideally that as we refine our views, we start converging? I'm just going to kind of throw up my hands, right? I don't really know what to make of that. I mean, I look at people as they are, and I look at 2,500 years and no convergence on intellectual grounds. There's sometimes convergence on other grounds, but it's temporary and it sort of comes and goes. So I'm not sure that we really have any reason, even under some kinds of idealizations, to think that improving our views is going to sort of push us closer together.
right. I guess I was trying to just thinking in terms of like just stipulating what it means, which views, kind of like defining the scoreboard, so to speak. Like consistency, that's a virtue. Persuasiveness, that's a virtue. Not to say that there you will be, because I mean, like you have a 3-point line, and I can imagine that in life, no one ever shot a 3-pointer and made it. But with that, but the question is, if they did, if they made this shot behind here, would it be 3 points? Like I'm just saying, like just idealizing. Do you think if a view was more consistent and more persuasive, would that be better than a view that was consistent but not persuasive?
Okay, so the story that I actually tell about comparing views starts with the kind of working out what the views say, and then the next step is checking for consistency. So consistency is important. And then the third step says taking consistency for granted. What are the virtues? What makes one view better than another? And I settle on two things, and persuasiveness doesn't really enter into this, but we'll see a way in which it might. On the one hand, you want to minimize your commitments. You want the view to be as simple as it can be, all else being equal. The other thing is you want it to explain as much as possible of your data, the stuff that needs explaining, whatever exactly that is. And then because you want to minimize your commitments and maximize your explanation, what you're aiming for is a sweet spot in the middle where you do the best that you possibly can trading those two things off. So your views not so simple that there's stuff that it fails to explain, and not so complicated that you're paying a ridiculous price in order to get explanations for some things. Right. Now, if that part of the story is right, and that's what we're trying to do, what makes one theory better than another or one worldview better than another is it does better at trading off simplicity against explanation, then maybe we should tie your persuasiveness to doing well at that task. Right. What makes a view persuasive is just that it does the best at trading off simplicity against explanation.
So then
And
persuasiveness
now,
would be a question.
now I can kind of accept what you say, but
Mm.
I'm really, in a way, I'm suggesting persuasiveness wasn't quite the right word because there's this more primitive thing about the virtues of worldviews or theories. That's what we really care about. And if persuasiveness comes along, it just comes along in its, you know, in its train, right? What you ought to be persuaded by, what you ought to be persuaded to accept is the best theory. The best theory is the one that's does best at trading off simplicity against explanation.
Right. But it does seem to me, and I know I'm not going to make the bandwagon fallacy of, saying that the numbers, the majority makes right. The most people that you can get to accept a view makes that view true or anything like that. But I'm saying, even in your statements when you said what we see in history is no convergence, right? Generally speaking, like you very, very little convergence, but in terms of like philosophy and religion and politics and maybe psychology and sociology, like all the soft sciences.
Well, no, I think that there's plenty of agreement in psychology and sociology.
Okay.
Right. I think that philosophy and religion are different from not just from the natural sciences, but from the human sciences as well.
Okay.
And there are kind of worries. Maybe we make less progress and it's kind of harder in the human sciences than it is in the natural sciences. But there's still lots of stuff that we know about psychology that, people before William James didn't know.
So it's a lot of agreement. It seems like, okay. So, but even to say that is to say something virtuous about science, right? To say that there is this convergence of thought. Like we say that, it seems like that's a positive thing, right? I don't hear people lamenting the fact that that there is a lot of convergence. They act like this is a sign of progress, right? And so that if we, maybe I would say a better view has this trade off of explanatory power and simplicity and persuasiveness, because I can see a view that has two views that have equal explanatory power and simplicity, but one is more persuasive. And it just seems like, since we value consensus, that view maybe it would be less related to truth, but it would have something else, like whatever persuasiveness is, that and for whatever purpose, convergence is a good thing, because I guess everybody can agree and be wrong. Right?
So it's an interesting question whether we value convergence on its own. I think that what really matters, what's kind of striking, is where you have independent global convergence. So you get people independently all over the world converging on the same answer, right? And that's what you get in natural science. So there are lots of nice examples of this. Shared Nobel Prizes, where a physicist in Pakistan and a physicist somewhere on the other side of the world, say in California, come up with the same theory at the same time independently, and they both win the prize.
That's insane.
Right. Now, what you don't get in religion is something like that, right, where it turns out that Indigenous Australians and Celts have the same religious beliefs and practices. It just doesn't work that way in general. Right. So it's not convergence, it's the kind of independent convergence that's the kind of significant signifier, in my opinion. We don't value convergence if it's get everybody to converge on naturalistic belief. Kill everybody else. Right? And now I've engineered consensus, but nobody, I mean, even amongst the people who've got the consensus, nobody's going to think that that consensus is worth anything, right?
Mm-hmm. So there has to be a type of, it can't be compelled or coerced.
No, but it can't be engineered. It's not, I mean, in that case, I wasn't in the case where we kill everybody else, we're not coercing them. We're just removing them from the picture so that what's left is a consensus, right? That a consensus that's achieved in, I mean, I'm being silly because that's not a realistic way, but a consensus that's not achieved in the right way isn't valuable.
Right. So it has to be achieved in the right way to be valuable. But I could see the people who were still living saying something like, you know what? Look how many of us agree. Like, this is great. And they could still take that as a reaffirming
I
sign.
think they'd be wrong, though, if they knew how it had been done.
Right. Yeah, that would.
They would have no reason to think, wow, suddenly our reasons, our previously controversial beliefs are now not in the least bit controversial. Everybody agrees, so we must have been right. That would be a terrible argument, right? That would be a terrible piece of reasoning.
Right. So it shows that convergence, just as such, isn't a virtue, but it must be reached in a way that is without engineering, like you said, engineering.
Yeah.
But it seems like when if you reach it, I guess because the context that I was thinking it would be in a discussion, in a kind of debate or argument where you're giving reasons for your views or just setting out your views. It seems like that would be if a person came to the belief, or if a person was able to bring more convergence by sharing their models. It seems like that's the right. I mean, that's the way we need to argue. And if you were able to do that, then that seemed like that would be I don't see anything wrong with convergence that way.
So I don't see anything wrong with that. That happens all the time locally. So, people go to study philosophy at a particular place. They end up with a particular set of philosophical opinions. Had they gone somewhere else, they would have probably ended up with a different set of philosophical opinions. But what happens on a global scale is that these local things come and go. So there have been periods in the last 100 years where Harvard, Oxford have been very influential, and there have been lots of people who've cleaved to particular opinions, but it doesn't last, right? And then it washes out, and that's the thing that I see in philosophy anyway. So sure, it might be if I don't know, like, who's a kind of charismatic figure in philosophy, it might be that lots of people cleave to the ideas of, I don't know, let's say David Lewis. Let's say this happened, because there were lots and lots of people who are very influenced by Lewis. In 100 years' time, prediction, there won't be lots of Lewisians around.
Mm-hmm.
It's a local thing, even though his influence in the UK, the US, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, various places was, for a period, was immense. It'll wash out.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I can imagine what if you told Lewis that in 100 years,
well,
like.
so I mean, I don't think that David would have been worried by that.
Yeah, he probably wouldn't have cared. It's like, yeah, you're right.
Well,
as long as I can take care of my family and eat and provide, I'm good. But Dr. Graham, Dr. Oppy, I don't want to hold you past your time, and I was already late coming on. So, but I thank you for your time, and thank you all for watching. And we would like just to give Dr. Oppy an open invitation to move into this next setting, the scene, into his method and his way of arguing. I'm thinking maybe that's a whole area, a new area of philosophy, the philosophy of dialectics or something. Give it a fancy name. But thank you all for watching, and always remember to think better.